database. Very interesting subject, worth looking at. And on Wednesday, the 1st of September, which is also the week where we're doing the Desktop First conference, which we'll talk about in a moment, we're going to be flying in the Microsoft Azure cloud, which sounds incredibly risky, but it's all about virtualization and these kind of offerings and services that you can get from Microsoft with their very powerful and all-encompassing Azure services. And on Wednesday the 8th, just to make sure we've got a good rounding of information and services in connection with that, we're going to be exploring the Amazon cloud, which is probably the competing or complementary service to Azure. Those two are the biggest cloud providers that we really come across in business, and so we're going to be talking about how to leverage those services and get a few people on that know about that kind of stuff. Today joining me is a man who, if you've been around in Delphi for a while, you surely should know who he is Bob Swart. Delphi developer, trainer, consultant, book author, Embarcadero MVP, and a reseller in Europe. He's been a Pascal developer since 1982. He actually trumps me on that. I thought I'd been a Delphi person for a long time, Pascal person for a long time, and Delphi since obviously the very first version that came out. You can follow Bob on Twitter. He is ebob42. You can also go to his website. In fact, this is his LinkedIn link there. So linkedin.com/in/Dr.Bob42, because that's also how he's known. He's taught me a lot. He's probably taught a few of the other MVPs quite a lot as well. And good afternoon, Bob.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm proud to be first-time presenter here on this format, and I hope we all enjoy ourselves tonight.
Thanks. I didn't know this was your first time. I'm absolutely surprised. You're a very prolific presenter and educator. I mean, most of us read several books of yours and papers and things like that. So it's really good to have you on today. Thanks for joining. Next person up is Dahlia Patel. She is a software developer, consultant, book author with some very good books, I have to say, about Delphi memory management. She's also said she's been crashing on other people's software and writing her own since 1985. She's got 2 books out, I think, Delphi Memory Management and Delphi Event-Based and Asynchronous Programming, all the tricky stuff that you think you really should know, and you think, oh, I don't know, I don't understand how this really works, but I'm going to copy this code here. If you want to know a bit more about those kind of things and the advantages you can get from that, then she's got those books. Her website is dahlia.krashnikar.info, as you can see on the link there. You can also find her on LinkedIn and Twitter as Dahlia JAP, so DALIJAP. Hello, Dahlia.
Hello, everyone.
And next up, with a remarkably good headshot, I have to say, you do look like you're some kind of 17th century Scottish prince or something. It's Alastair Christie. That is a smouldering look worthy of any catalogue pose, I think. He's a Delphi MVP, a consultant, developer, trainer, presenter, and author. Everybody on here today, I think, apart from me, is an author. I'm an author of other stuff, but not actually Delphi books. And he lives on a lifestyle block in New Zealand, which I had to Google, and now I know what they are. I'm absolutely impressed. They're really quite remarkable things. You can find him on the web at learndelphi.tv, and you can find him on LinkedIn as Alastair Christie with an I. And I have to say, I've learned many, many things from Alastair. Alastair is the guy who really seems to make all the videos of all the cool tips and tricks you could ever want to know. And Code Faster in Delphi is one of the books I've got. Great stuff. Hello, Alastair.
Hello, Ian. Thank you for the introduction.
Now, are you dressed like you are in your headshot today? Because we don't. Well, our cameras are not working today. So
yeah, no, I'm a bit more casual this morning. It's just after 5 a.m. here, so.
So probably just as well the web camera's not on. Yes.
Yeah, but blurry-eyed.
Exactly. And finally, myself, who's hosting today on behalf of Jim. My name's Ian Barker. I'm a prolific British-American software developer and designer. I'm a narrator. I do audiobooks and things like that. I'm a writer. You'll find me writing all sorts of articles and things like that on the blogs.embarcadero.com and a few other places as well. I'm a published poet and an ex-performing poet. Used to be hanging around with some bards and people like that back in the UK and also in Omaha when I lived up there. And of course, I am also an Embarcadero Delphi MVP. Born in London, England, hence the accent, but I live now in Dallas, Texas, in USA. And yes, I do say that Delphi is my superpower, and trust me, it really is. I'm a very lazy programmer. I code every day writing Delphi code, and Delphi makes me look great, so I'm very grateful to it. You can find me on the web at about.me/Ian Barker, and you can follow me on Twitter as @punctuation. It'll come up as check digits, but you get the general idea. Just before we start, a brief word about an upcoming event. It's a huge event. We put a lot of effort into it, and there are many, many good speakers, not just Delphi people, but designers and presenters and authors. I can't remember all the people that are involved, but there's some really great people there. It is the Desktop First User Experience Summit of 2021. We ran this last year. It was extremely popular. We had many thousands of people. I'm not exaggerating. Thousands of people registered for it, and lots of views on videos that were put up there. It's a combination of some panel talks, as well as some live presentations, pre-recorded presentations, code demonstrations, as well as general, more esoteric descriptions of things like how to design for the desktop rather than the mobile device. You're going to hear a lot about it in the next couple of weeks. It's running from August the 30th to September the 3rd. If you go to summit.desktopfirst.com, you can book your ticket, and it's completely free for the whole week. Definitely recommend it. I'll be presenting there. I think a few of the others on today are also presenting there, and just about everybody who you could ever want will be turning up and giving you the benefit of their experiences, good and bad, about designing for desktop. So it is tea, coffee, and code. Grab a coffee or a tea or whatever your beverage of your choice is, and relax. We're going to be talking today about unit testing, integration testing, test-driven development, application quality, which really is the thing that comes out of those first three subjects. Source metrics, being able to measure what is good and what's bad, and give some hints on whether your source code is a little bit more complicated than it should be, or areas where it could be improved or speeded up. And code coverage, which is related to testing and all the other things as well. How many bits of your code do these tests relate to? I'm also going to be talking about the tools of unit and integration testing, DUnit, DUnit2, DUnit X, and Test Insight. These are really Delphi-focused test frameworks, and during the discussion we'll just talk about what we mean by that as well. We're also going to talk about functional testing using things like Test Complete, RANORX, and AutoIt. These are different types of technology. I will come back to these slides as we discuss things, but all of these are worth Googling if you haven't already. There is a slide handout for all the slides that we're including today, and there will be a replay. So we get asked over and over again when we do these things, will there be a replay? Absolutely, there will be a replay. And you won't be able to miss it. It'll be on Twitter, and it'll be on the Embarcadero website and a few others as well. And we're going to be talking about testing levels and things like that as well. So I think whoa, there's a weird noise going on in the background there. I'm just going to go through and see what else we've got. Okay, I think we will start by going back a moment and letting a few people talk. I'm not sure who prepared all the slides here. Who would like to talk first about some of these subjects then? who volunteers to be the person?
Oh, I can say something if you like.
Go for it.
Yeah. So most people, I mean, most of the organizations I've been have had some form of integration and unit testing. Usually, unit testing seems to be less common. And functional testing, of course, which is basically just running your application and trying it typically, but you can automate all of these things. And particularly unit testing is probably where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. Indeed. And I don't practice a lot of I don't write a lot of unit tests, but I've got some, and I certainly don't do unit test-driven development. Does anyone here follow test-driven development?
Well,
Not me.
Probably nobody is doing it the way it's supposed to be done.
See, we should have Olaf Monion should be on here, because I'm sure Olaf is the kind of guy that does test-driven development. I'm sure I've seen him somewhere say about that. I was talking to I think Holger, and I forget who the other person was, and we were discussing test-driven development, and Holger was like, Holger's a very good programmer. I got a lot of respect for Holger. He's a good friend of mine. We talk often, and he was saying, oh, I don't want to be on this conference because I don't know anything about test-driven development. And I think the summary was, a lot of people don't know much about test-driven development. For those that listen, if they don't know, do you want to describe it, Alastair? Or?
So yeah, there's a slide on test-driven development, if you want to go to that one.
Sure.
So I've tried practicing it a few times, but not really in any large sort of product. But effectively, rather than writing your code and then kind of writing tests to fit that code, you instead, hopefully you know what you want to achieve before you actually write some code. So in theory, you could write a test to test that code. So, if you're wanting to add, say, two complex numbers or something like that, you're doing a class for complex numbers, you could write all the tests for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and what have you, before you actually write any sort of production code, because you know the outputs from that. Now, you obviously don't always know what your code is going to look like, but yeah, where you can, I think test-driven development can be really good. So basically, effectively, you run this loop where you write a failing test. So you'd have, your test for adding two complex numbers, 1 plus I, and it should equal 1 plus I, should be your output. And when you initially write your code, your functional sort of stub for that in your production code, you just output 1 or something like that, or 0, and then run your test. Your test will fail, and then you write code to make that test passed. And if you're using something like Test Insight, there's a little you can press every time you save, or press a button, it can run the tests for you, and it gives you a little indicator whether it's green or red in the IDE. I'd certainly recommend giving Test Insight a go. It's free, so and it plugs in with all of the unit frameworks.
Yeah, I think Test Complete is one of those things where people go, oh, I didn't know about this, and then when they discover it and start using it, they're like, wow, this is actually very good. I mean, I've worked in quite a few different software houses over the years for Delphi, and also back in the day, Visual Basic and C. I used to be a C programmer. And back when I was a C programmer, nobody did unit testing. The thing just didn't exist. I'm talking about the days of Unix in the early 80s. But the way that we did testing was always after the event, if you see what I mean. The standard practice is to, as you've put on this slide here, write a failing test and then make some code to make that test pass. the experience I've had with more than one software house was that they used Final Builder, for example. What Final Builder does, for those that don't know, is it takes a reasonably complicated program. It's not, if you've just got one executable, then it's largely pointless. But if you've got a complex system that pulls in code from multiple developers and has a path of things to create, deploys to a FTP site or deploys to a website, or back in the day, output to a CD or something like that. Final Builder will help you build all your installs. It'll help you compile all of the code. It'll pull the things in from repositories and stuff like that. But one of the other things it's got included is the ability to run tests. And so it was an early form of continuous integration, and it allowed you to run your builds all the time as people check stuff in. So as soon as someone made some changes and checked it into the main core project, Final Builder would run and it would produce a test output of the project. And the test output would include tests, unit tests, like we're talking about here. If the unit tests passed and your code was checked in, then it would actually generate a product, a test product, into the staging area rather than production area. So you could then pass it on to a QA department, or if you had some other form of automated user interface testing, like AutoIt was one of the things they used. RoboKey, I think, was another product that I've seen used, where it actually runs your program as if a user is using it, and then compares the results, using bitmap comparisons and things like that back in the day. That was a secondary thing. So I've never seen anybody do test-driven development, but I have seen people do post-coding testing, and quite often they'll write the tests after they've written the code rather than at the same time. So.
Indeed. I think either practice is...
Can I add something here, please?
Test at all.
Go ahead.
My experience with either unit testing or test-driven development is we found it very important and beneficial if the person who writes the tests is not the same person who wrote the original code, because you will be blind for your own code. You will be blind for errors in your own code. So in the project that I worked on, we always had one person testing the code from someone else, and I had to test his code to make sure that you don't write the test and then implement the things that will pass your test only.
Yeah. And actually, that's a very good thing. It's like when you write a memo to someone or a letter, you miss all the spelling mistakes. You miss all the typos. My Alexa was talking in the background. You miss all the typos, you miss all the spelling mistakes, and you miss whole sentences that you completely forgot. And you double check the memo or the email and you send it off, and then you discover that you made a glaring error just after you click send. And that's really the summary of what happens with code, as you're saying. You write code, you can look at it, you can run it in a kind of functionality point of view. You run it, compare it to whatever the spec is that you've been given, or whatever the outline or frame wireframe is. But you won't spot some glaring errors unless there's some tests. Particularly if it gets
and if you make it a competition, see how many errors he can find in my code and I can find in his code or her code, then it's actually even a little bit fun.
Yeah, your idea of fun is not my idea of fun. Yeah, it's true. I mean, in the right environment, a competitive coding can be useful because it provokes people to try and outdo each other in terms of quality, and that's always a good thing.
One of the problems you have with test-driven development, when you write tests first, you have to really know what your code is going to look like. You need to have really good specifications. You need to know your inputs. You need to know your outputs. And a lot of time you don't really know that upfront. So it is good if you can do that, but most of the time people write code as they go, and you're exploring possibilities. You're not sure whether you will write something in one way or the other, and some things change. along the way. It is easy to write tests first when you have very simple scenarios, but in more complicated ones, it soon falls apart. You're more occupied by writing code and solving other problems than thinking about writing tests first. So I don't think it is important to write tests first. It is more important to write code in a way that it can be tested later on. That doesn't mean you shouldn't test your code, but you can write code first and then test it. It can be soon after you write it. You don't want to leave that long enough without testing, but you don't. Order is not important.
Yeah, and in fact, whilst we talk about that as well, there's another thing that we should probably make clear. One questioner here, and unfortunately, it scrolled off my screen. Let's see if I can just find him again. Yeah, Ivan Sugeng. Apologise if I'm saying your name wrong. Ivan, he says, oh, but you know, what about if you change no good or something like that? When we talk about unit tests, it's an unfortunately named subject. It's not testing a unit as in a Delphi unit, you know, unit.pass, but actually testing units of your code. And the unit that you're testing is classes, for example, or even interfaces. You know, you build an interface that that is used by other classes, and what you do is you create a test that will exercise that interface, the I interfaced object, not a user interface. And when we talk about units, we're talking about granular things, much more granular than just a unit.pas, you know, a unit of Delphi code. And that's quite an important distinction to make. The name unit testing came over from other languages, like Java and a few other things as well. And obviously the word unit in Delphi and Pascal means something quite different to unit, a unit of measurement type word.
Yeah, so that's true. Your unit test should, each test should be testing the smallest, I suppose, atomic, if you like, you know, the smallest indivisible part of your code. So, you know, each function should be tested. Typically, you have a suite of tests for each class. And you want the code to run as fast as possible. So you definitely don't want to be hitting the file system or database. You want to be running, you know, thousands of tests, and they should all compile and run within a few seconds at most.
Yeah, and someone's saying presumably Martin Ballinger actually, presumably you need a functional specification before you can design and write the tests. Well, actually, I would argue that you need a functional specification before you can actually write the code in the first place. So, I mean, if you, you know, I work with quite a lot of entrepreneurs, and entrepreneurs is a code name for difficult people to work with, and these kind of people who tend not to be very technical, but are very, very good at business and they've got some very fixed ideas on what they want out of a product. Will not necessarily want to be tied down to what we would think of as a functional specification as a programmer. The danger of that is if someone says to you, here's a sketch of what I want, and then they talk to you over the phone about what they want from the program, the chances are you won't give them what they want. You'll give them what you think they want. And that if you are not actually having a specification that gives you some quite clear what we would call user stories in user interface design, a description of what should happen when a user is using that program. A person clicks on a button and the following should happen, and this person is trying to achieve the following with your program, then you're not going to write the program in the first place and probably meet the expectations of the person that's asked you to do it. And secondly, you cannot write a test until you've thought up what your code is going to be. Now, if you've got a functional specification that says, here's the things that we need in the background to make this person's wishes happen. Even if it's at a broader level of, I need to write a web server and it does this, and I need to write a Windows service that does that, and I need to write some middleware that does the following. Then you can test it. But if you don't even get that far, and all you've got is some roughed out screenshots or wireframes and an overview of what the person wants in the program, then how on earth are you going to write it successfully? How are you going to quote for it, and tell someone how long you think it's going to take, and how are you going to know when you're finished? Because one of the most important things in a specification is a definition of done, a definition of success. And really, a test is focusing your mind on what is successful on a particular class or object. If you're writing a class that does something, for example, like calculate someone's pay dates from one date to another date, you are going to have some certain parameters that you understand that you need from that payroll information. And you understand things like the frequency. They're going to be paid every week, they're going to be paid every 2 weeks, they're going to be paid every month. But you've got to clearly define what that class is going to do in order it to be successful. And by writing a test that tests that class out, and as I tend to do, write an actual test app that doesn't look like the real thing but tests all the features of that class, it will make you a more successful programmer, even if it won't make you a better programmer. So do you need a functional specification before you can design and write tests? Probably, yeah, because you shouldn't be writing code in the first place.
Probably the most important thing, because if you don't know specifications, you cannot know your input, you don't know your outputs, and then you cannot write any tests around any code. So this part is extremely important, and it comes even before writing tests and before writing code. So when you have that, it is less important whether you write tests first or you write your code first. For instance, it is very easy in Delphi to write some class template, to write your procedures and functions, and then you can generate tests of unit tests from that class. But you cannot do it the other way around. You cannot generate the class from the tests. So this is where you save time. You write your class wireframe first, and then generate tests from that, empty tests, of course, and then you can fill those tests and code in the order which you find suitable at the moment. There is no one size fits all. Some people work better when they write code first, some maybe want to write tests first, but it is important that you have specifications and that you know your inputs and your outputs.
Yeah, and nailing some people down to get that specification is the hard part sometimes. As programmers, we're very much living in a world full of rules. Syntax of a programming language is just a whole set of rules, and we excel at making sure we follow those rules. If it's got to have a comma, it's got to have a comma. There's no two ways about it. If it needs to end with a semicolon, then it definitely has to end with a semicolon. The rest of the world, the rest of the planet, think we're weird because we think like that. And so when we start saying things like, well, we need tests set up to validate that the program works properly, some people who are not technical don't get it, and they think it's a waste of time. And in fact, you will find, in my experience anyway, resistance from non-technical people in spending any time that isn't directly producing some kind of functional output, a screen or a printout or whatever you're developing is supposed to have an end result for. It's going to be a conflict that always exists, but writing tests helps protect everybody, because
indeed, I mean, the cost of bugs going into production can be horrific. There's a was it Night Capital that lost 450 million over the period of about 45 minutes because of a bug.
Well, there's the
Basically,
famous one, isn't there, of an Apollo rocket that went up and was supposed to angle so many degrees to the right to, you know, get its escape trajectory and escape velocity. And instead of doing that, it got up to the right height and angled straight down and pointed at the ground and smashed into the ground. And when they went back to look at it, they realized that it was down to a minus sign or a positive symbol being wrong. And this was prior to testing, but this is, you know, the early days of NASA, where those people were very, very smart and did a lot of, you know, testing prior to launching rockets, obviously. And it's one of those things, you're going to put a bunch of people into space, but on a smaller scale, I write time and attendance systems and those linked to payroll. And if I get it wrong, 1,000 people get paid incorrectly. Now, your average employee who doesn't get paid enough is going to come and bang on the payroll person's door and complain and say, I'm $10 short, or I'm £100 short this week. But the people that get paid £10 or £100 more or £1,000 more do not tend to come and tell people. They think, well, let's wait and see if the company notice.
Yes,
so
you say £1,000, it could be 10,000 or 100,000 as well. I mean, it's...
well, I think once they get into 100,000, they start to worry that someone's definitely going to notice. Isn't it Office Space, where he gets the decimal place in the wrong place, and he goes to the ATM and he goes in there and there's like $1 million in the bank account or something. He's like, oh no, I always do this. I get this decimal place in the wrong place. I totally know your pain. I totally understand that. But it's true. I mean, you know, without tests, how can I put, you know, the first thing they'll say is, what happens if you've made a mistake to my payroll? And the answer is, yeah, I go and hide.
Yeah, you kind of can contrast that, the amount of effort that might be required correcting the pay of, you know, 1,000 people or 10,000 people, compared to, you know, having a number of tests that may well have prevented that from happening in the first place. Finding the bugs sooner can be, you know, worthwhile, quite a bit of effort.
I mean, that's the point, isn't it? It's finding the problems sooner. It doesn't mean to say that you'll find all the problems, because, you know, the program without bugs is a program that's not been written.
Yeah, or it's very trivial.
Yeah, well, even trivial ones, you know. Trust me, I've done enough demos.
Probably write FizzBuzz without any bugs, but it's not a useful application. Yeah. Something that Stephen Carr has mentioned is that if you find a bug, it's good to write a test for it first to confirm that bug, and then you've got a reproducible way of determining whether that bug is still in the code. And that way, when you're working on fixing said bug, you'll immediately know when it's been fixed, because your test will start passing.
I've actually had a guy on Delphi Worlds, which is Dave Nottage's server, I think, his Discourse server, I'm not sure. A guy called Richard Hatherall, who is a regular flyer on our little Teacock and Go, and he says he does test-driven development. So there you are. There are people out there who are doing it. I would say that it's not as common as perhaps it should be. It's one of these things where we all know that it's the right thing to do in the general scheme of things, maybe. But the reality is that it's not common for people to do it. Now, I don't know whether the likes of Google and Microsoft do that. I have worked at places where one of the rules for development was, if you write some code, before you check it in, you have to write a test that tests the code and check the test in at the same time. And they actually have on their repositories, you must, there's like a little acceptance thing for checking in any pull requests or anything like that, where it checks to see if there's a test. So there are organizations where testing is absolutely mandatory.
If you look at this,
nobody knows whether you have written your code first or your test first. But yes, that is a good thing to do, to have a test and code to go together. But like I said, the order is not so important. It is important to do what is most productive for you. So if it is more productive to write code first, you should write code first, but also you should write tests. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't write tests or that you should write tests in a month or so. But order is not so important.
If you look at SQLite, which is probably the most prolifically used database on the planet by probably a very large order of magnitude, their test code, I think, is about 300 times bigger than their production code. So they have a huge amount of code dedicated to testing, and that has allowed them to make significant changes to their code without, putting bugs into production. So your test code can actually represent more than your production code, particularly if you've got a high level of test coverage, getting close to 100%.
Yeah, and I mean, as I said before with Final Builder, once the tests actually passed, and so you were doing unit testing, you were testing individual classes and individual functions and procedures and the output from those, it would then say, oh, the build's successful and you've managed to check in your code successfully, and it's all good. It's now going to go to the staging, the testing area. It would have it has like a beta area and a final production area, but in the staging area, it then ran a load of unit tests, in the sense that it would actually test the functionality of the program as if someone was using the applications. And those tests would run for hours. They were going very fast. They were using robot typers, I suppose you would call them, like a human being. Some poor soul had gone in from the QA department and recorded all the clicks to make things work. Click on this bit and this should happen, click on that bit, this should happen, enter this value in this field and the following should happen on the screen. And it tested it at the UI level and at the output. If it ran a report, then it took a PDF or whatever the output was, and it would know what that should look like based on the inputs that had been put into the user interface, and then compared the output at a kind of visual level. It did it, how would you put it? Kind of like, did a bitmap compare, I suppose. And it would check that the application works. Why I've got something beeping in the background here, I'm gonna have to shut that up. But yeah, it was pretty interesting, really. The different concepts that people have of testing. It can be annoying, but yeah, you can end up doing a lot more work. But really, it's work up front rather than work afterwards that the customers found. And if you're working in the right environment, say military or big business or critical industries like power and electrical type things, or water or food, then testing can help save lives, literally. So it's a funny thing.
Yeah,
okay.
If you Google people interested in knowing more about Robert C. Martin and test-driven development, sorry.
Oh,
if you
okay.
If you Google Robert C. Martin on or YouTube, you'll find a lot of videos on programming professionalism. And he says if you're not doing TDD, you're not being professional. But he also makes the point that at some point, some programmer is going to write some code that kills 10,000 people, and government is going to then say, how could this possibly happen? And fingers are going to get pointed at programmers, and we're then going to have lots of legislation saying what can happen. And in fact, am I still connected?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So yeah. So his opinion is that we need to have practices in place now, so that when such a disaster happens, we can say that we're following these practices and that it is sort of the best that can be done. And test-driven development is a good practice for reducing the number of mistakes and stuff in code.
Well, I suppose it's also demonstrating best practices, but also demonstrating good faith, so that if something does go wrong, you've taken steps, you've made your best effort to avoid something going wrong. But you know, it's the old adage: if something can go wrong, it will. But really, putting tests in and putting validation and all those other things are using your best practices to say, I know it went wrong, but look, I did make some professional efforts to try and avoid the bad stuff that happening. And it could be just enough to actually, you know, get you in trouble, but save your skin financially and professionally. You know, it depends on the people you're working for. I work for people who are not very forgiving on mistakes, but that's the kind of business I'm in. You know, people don't buy time and attendance systems and things like that because they're nice. They tend to do it because they're either trying to save money or be evil to their staff. And I apologise to those that aren't doing that, but that is the overwhelming factor behind some of the driving forces of people who have biometric clocking in systems and things like that. It's often to avoid, you know, staff thieving time, which is, you know, time theft is a problem. But you know, if you're going to start accusing people of not turning up for work or being sick or more often than they should, or actually directly affecting someone's pay, you really need to know that what you're saying is true. And I try and prove that by saying, well, look, here's the kind of test that I did to ensure that this code was as we expected. You know, it functioned as we thought it would function. And this particular scenario here, where this person did this, and this, and triggered a you know, a false positive on them being a crook, was with our best intentions behind it. We didn't, you know, we did what we could, but sometimes these things happen because it's computers, and computers do stupid stuff. So yeah, that's the way
often it is hard to predict all corner cases. So people usually tend to say that even tested code has bugs, and they use it as an argument against testing. But if you missed some corner case, if you don't have tests for all edge cases, if you do have tests and if your code is testable, then adding new test is very simple, and fixing that code is much easier than code that doesn't have any tests. So this is not a good argument against testing, but it is quite often used as bad argument. But
yeah, and getting the test wrong, of course, is the other possibility, that you write a test and the test is useless. You know, the test is only at the end of the day, test is a piece of program code, and you know, you can make an assumption and get the assumpment wrong. So you know, human beings are fallible, unfortunately. And
yes, another argument, very common argument, is that in complex scenarios, since you cannot unit test databases, web services, or things like that, that all you do is testing mocks, and this is not testing. But this is where integration testing comes to play. So unit testing is only the starting level. It is not all that you need to do. So first you test your classes in isolation. You see whether classes on their own work as they should, and then you step to the next level and you start with integration testing. And you can also use same tools for integration testing that you use for unit testing. It is just a matter of how much code you are testing with different kinds of testing.
Yeah,
yeah. Your unit test should run pretty much every time you save. Integration testing might be you do that perhaps before you check in, or maybe it's part of the automated build process. So if you're using continuous integration or continuous deployment type practices, then you could do that, because the integration tests tend to take a lot longer to run. They might take hours. And then functional testing, it can be done. That's actually when you basically run the application and verify. You might have a script or something like that you go through to test various aspects of it. And you can actually automate that as well, which we'll look at in one of the other slides.
Yeah, we're going to get through that. We've got another hour and 10 minutes at least, so it's all good. Bob, do you have anything to add? Because I'm very aware of you being lurking in the background and being being quiet.
Yes, well, no, but the main comment I made was that you should not do testing on your own. You should have a colleague and work together with on the tests.
Yeah, what are your thoughts on pair programming?
I've got nothing to add, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I mean, what are your thoughts on pair programming? Have you ever done that kind of thing, or do you think that's a benefit? You know, where two people are actually effectively coding at the same time and you know, reviewing each other's code simultaneously.
Yes, that's actually what I'm doing on a daily basis. We use GitLab and SourceTree as source maintenance tools and merging the source code, but we're working at the same time on the same code.
Right.
Yeah. How does that work for
code? So I guess that's what you call pair development.
Yes,
yeah. Typically, pair development is two people sitting in front of the same computer. One person is sort of
we're working remotely,
and the other person is actually writing the code. So, and then they kind of swap between those two roles regularly during the process.
Well, I would interject there and say that actually that's not my experience of pair programming, because I have done it. I don't like it. I find it distracting because I want to get in the zone and write the code, and you know, it comes out my head in a kind of dump of consciousness, a brain dump.
I fully agree with that. The only caveat I would say is that if you've got sort of junior developers and you're wanting to get them trained up, that is probably the fastest way of doing it. And also, people, you might have experienced developers, but they might be unfamiliar with the product that's being developed, and it kind of getting their head in the same space as you know, using the same practices as everyone else as well to reduce conflict.
I think the one thing that is missing from the RAD Studio IDE at the moment is the ability to put in a feature that is, and dare I say it, on an Embarcadero broadcast, but I will. In Visual Studio Code, they have a very good ability to share simultaneously. So one person could be sitting in America and another person could be sitting in the UK or wherever, or New Zealand or somewhere, and you're both looking at the same unit of code, so same file. And it's a bit like if you've used Google Docs, where you can both edit the same document, you know, a text document at the same time. You can see the other person's cursor, and you can see them write code. I mean, it depends on how you've set it up. What you can set it up so that one's a follower and the other one is the person who's the editor. But it allows the people to actually navigate through the code, and the other person's screen will follow that navigation. But you can switch that off and just simultaneously edit the same file. I don't know why you'd want to do that. It seems to me like a very good way of confusing yourself, but it's extreme pair programming. But if the other person is merely there to make suggestions on whether they think a unit, you know, an idea is a good direction to head in, or perhaps help out on the use of an SDK or an API or something like that, it's very, very good. I've used it to teach junior programmers on, you know, they'll send me some code and say, I've written this bit, what are your thoughts? And then I want to actually be able to share with them and say, you see where you wrote this bit here in 25 lines of code? There was a function you could use, it did that in one line of code. And that happens quite often, mainly because they should be watching Alastair's LearnDelphi.tv, and then they would learn all the shortcuts. But that is a function that I would like to see in the Delphi IDE, because that ability to do that kind of shared learning experience for a junior developer and a more senior developer helps both sides. Because me as the senior developer, it helps me revisit some of the things I've been doing for years with a fresh pair of eyes. Because a junior developer will look at it and go, well, why on earth would you write code that way when you could do it this way? And I go, oh yeah, I never thought about it that way because I've always done it this way, you know. And I think that kind of
there's nothing that makes sure you understand something than teaching it.
Cardboard cutout.
I would use TeamViewer for that. I will choose TeamViewer, just log on to the other programmer's machine, and then we can work on the file together.
Yeah, we've done that before now as well. And I know some people that work remote. I work remote permanently. And in fact, I've been remote for 12 or 13 years or something like that. And it works well for me. I rarely go and sit in people's offices and code for lots of different reasons, not just because of the pandemic. But some people want to actually, I don't, because I'm really antisocial despite being a very social person. But some people actually want to have the feeling of being together, you know, when they're coding. And so they do this thing where they'll have TeamViewer or Zoom and do a coding session. You can, in fact, I think there's a website for it. I can't remember what the website was, but they would, you pick a person and say, oh, I'm going to be coding at 9 a.m. in the morning on Thursday, and I'm going to be writing some Pascal code or, you know, C# code or something like that. And it meets up with this other person, and this person is also a developer, and they can actually Zoom together and as if they're sitting in the same office. It's a bizarre idea, but I actually get why they're doing it. It's a little bit removed from what you're talking about, Bob, where you're saying you use TeamViewer and actually see the person coding. All they're doing is, I think, sharing what they feel they want to share. So they have the webcam on, and they feel like they allow each other, I think it's like 30 minutes blocks. And after 30 minutes, you can then get a 10-minute break and talk to each other about what you're doing. And then they agree a set of rules. So they might say no talking at all during the 30 minutes. And then in the 10-minute break, you can both sit back and describe what you just wrote and explain what you found difficult. And the other person can talk to you about what they just wrote and found difficult as well. And it allows people to kind of use a cardboard cutout solution. So by explaining something to someone, particularly if it's something you're stuck on, it can sometimes be enough that your really clever subconscious mind solves the problem as you're talking. How many times have you said, I'm really stuck on this problem and I'm doing this, that. Oh, wait, actually, I know how I could do that. And that happens to me now and again. So yeah, different way of viewing programming. TeamViewer, interesting. Okay, integration testing. What do we mean by that then, people?
Well, integration testing is when you are testing integration between classes and other code components. That means when you have several classes and they all need to work together, after you have tested them in isolation and you know that code inside them that is not connected to the outside world works properly, then you have to test whether those classes work together well, because you can have problems with integration. You can set the wrong property, call the wrong function. You can forget to set some piece in some class that other class needs and stuff like that. So this also means testing with some databases included, or web services, or anything else that is not part of the unit testing. So if you have some web service, you want to test that service also. You need to know whether it functions with your code or not. And the unit testing covers mocking the service and testing mocked data you will receive, and testing whether you are processing the data correctly. But you also need to test in real life and see whether your code will actually connect with your web service correctly. You can have problems with that part too. So you need to test whether those parts are working correctly.
Yeah, and in fact, Alejandro Aguilar, Alejandro, isn't that he or she? I apologize if I'm getting your gender wrong, but I think it's a guy. Alejandro, he says unit test helps you to think always in coding decoupled classes, as you have to test each of the classes by themselves or on their own. And that is actually really a very good point, that what unit testing does is encourages you not to have a class or an interface that sprawls across your code, and because it has to stand on its own for the purpose of the test, in that you have a set up and tear down code for a test. If you're not sure what I'm talking about there, then you need to probably go to some of the links we've put up and have a look. But that setup code will test whether your class or object is truly standalone and decoupled from the rest of your code, so it doesn't have dependence on something else that you've written that it shouldn't have. And that in itself, in some ways, is probably a very, very good reason to write tests, because if you write some universal class that's going to do something that's going to be reused over and over again, for example, as I used before, payroll export, and you've got a class that deals with people's payroll frequency. If you have made it rely on other parts of your program, for example, the employees' records or something like that, or some part of the user interface, which you really shouldn't be, test is going to reveal that early on before it's too late, and that code goes to production, and then you suddenly go to include it in another unrelated piece of the application, and it wants to pull in 57 different units, none of which are relevant to the thing you're trying to write. And so writing unit tests does encourage you to modularize and decouple your code in the way you should. And I know it sounds like it's all fancy, arty kind of, oh, this is ridiculous, nobody should do that. But trust me, once you start doing it, you suddenly think, well, I don't know why I never did this before, because it makes life a lot easier. It is a little bit more work, but it's a little bit more work up front and not later on when you're going back to fix some horrible bug with about 15 minutes to get it done before your customer goes completely freaky on you. Yeah, and integration testing, in some ways, the integration testing, if you've done your tests correctly, and integration testing should be plain sailing. I think it just depends on how far your integration is going to go and what that really represents in terms of integrating. I mean, component developers, for example, have got terrible time of developing components because there's so many different versions of the IDE. There's so many different, operating system variations on languages and versions and things like that. If they don't have tests, I don't know how they do their job. And if they don't have integration tests, how on earth do they know that they're going to release a set of components and those components are going to work? I don't know. That's the answer. Okay, system testing. Well, I think we kind of covered that. Testing larger parts of the software of the system as a whole.
So this would be testing at the sort of executable level. So when you've actually got an exe, you're going to make sure that it at least starts up, for instance. And you can automate a lot of this, but it's as the tests get more complicated. So the unit tests are quite stable, so you can often change the code, and it might break 1 or 2 unit tests, and but you can then fix those up. Integration tests, you're going to break more tests, but system tests, you can pretty much all your system tests can fall over when you start changing the layout of your application. So one of the features of the sort of testing is the more high level you get, the more fragile they become.
Well, system testing includes all alpha testing and beta testing with your customers or with your quality and assurance people. So, but like Alastair said, you're testing larger parts or complete system. So you have your functional software, and then you can also test. You can automate some parts of those tests. For instance, GUI test. There are some. There is software that allows you to test GUIs, and most of those software, I think, works on final application, because you need to, you are scanning location of your controls on specific positions, and then you are triggering some actions. So that is all part of system testing. Of course, you can test GUI with some lower level tools and some unit testing tools where you can send messages to your Windows controls and simulate the user, but it all depends on what kind of applications you have.
Yeah, AutoIt, for example, is one of the key apps that's used for that. It's basically a macro recorder on steroids, and if you just Google AutoIt, that is literally what it's called. And the way that can also do some very clever things, like it's got a window finder, and so in your application you use AutoIt and you call this window finder up. You hover over whatever control it is, and it will grab the handle and the actual class name of the control. So it can then say, I must click on this particular class of button. And the useful thing about that is, if you move it somewhere, it's not then dependent on the resolution. So it can test your application by clicking on the OK button, for example, or the print button, and know where that print button is, even though the resolution of the screen is not the same as when you wrote the tests.
Oh, and even if you've shifted the print button, for instance, in your application.
And you can also check whether it's enabled and disabled as well, and it does a lot of other things as well. It's very, very clever. I've used it in the past for GUI testing. There's also a web driver as well that does, if you write web programs or your interface is partially web-based, then there's a lot of web-based testing, more of those available, because obviously there's a lot more web pages out there to test. But any user interface like that, there's some for Linux that work in a similar way, that are basically used to automate things, but can be used also to do acceptance testing and system testing, where your application runs and then a robot macro on steroids clicks all the buttons for you, so you don't have to have some poor intern sitting there clicking on buttons and going, did it work? Did it work? Did it work? I mean, I don't know about you, but I started out in the 80s, and I was a COBOL programmer, and one of my first jobs, but that wasn't coding, was literally testing the output of the other COBOL developers. I was an intern. I wasn't an intern, actually. I was just a junior. And that was one of our jobs. And there is nothing more soul destroying than being told to go through the program and click on buttons and enter information. This was Unix. There were no macros available. And oh boy, there were days where I just really thought I'd chosen the wrong career. Well, luckily now, with Windows, there's a lot more, and Linux, there's a lot more automation that's available. And that kind of automation is very clever, because it will look, as I say, it can take a screenshot of the screen before you click a button, and take a screenshot of the screen after you click a button or enter some values or perform some other process. And it's clever enough, it can do a comparison and say, well, wait a minute, the screen on the test when the test was live is not the same as the screen on the when you set the test up. And you can exclude things like the date and time, if it's a status bar at the bottom of your screen, or a clock or something like that, and say, well, I'm only really going to care about this particular region of the screen, and draw out a rectangle. But it's very, very useful, and it can be like an extra employee sitting there looking over your shoulder and go, oh, you really messed that bit up. It didn't work when they clicked on the print button.
Yeah, I think AutoIt is free. Is that?
Yes, yeah, it is free.
Yeah, whereas the Test Complete and Ranorex are quite expensive as tools. But yeah,
Final Builder has got some features as well. Final Builder's, I think, about $700 for the kind of premium version. Yeah, I mean, Test Complete is painfully expensive, but it just depends on the organisation that you're working for.
And it's a lot cheaper than having dedicated QA people, working through scripts.
Yeah, I mean, even if you outsource it,
it's the cheapest.
Yeah, Yeah, exactly.
So if you have automated tests, then you don't need as much as people as you would need if you test it manually. Of course, many software is not tested at all, so it is tested only manually and only halfway.
Yeah.
Sometimes
just
change
a couple of
piece of application and you break some other part and you don't even know it because you don't have it tested. So
like juggling jello, as they say, it's, you move things around and other bits fall off. Yeah, it happens. Just a couple of housekeeping statements, I suppose. A few people have mentioned the slides aren't working. Yes, I know that. Unfortunately, I don't have the slide handouts at the moment. We will make sure you get them. But the link that Jim put up is broken. So he's the one with that slide, and he's not available for me to get them from him at the moment, so I can't put that handout there. We'll make sure you get it, don't worry. There will be a blog post on blogs.embarcadero.com about this particular webinar or talk or teacoff in code, whatever we want to call it. So there will be some links there, and I'll make sure that they get sent out. A couple of other people said they have problems with the audio. The reason we're not on a webcam today, and the reason you can't see us smiling and laughing and crying, depending on what's happening, is there's something wrong with GoToWebinar. We don't know what it is. GoToWebinar, when it works, is great, but right now they're saying that there's a problem with the webcams. And in fact, I've just checked now, and they're still not working. There's a little message from GoToWebinar saying that their webcam service is down. So they can stream the audio like we are at the moment, and they can stream our screens, but what they can't do is actually show our webcam. So I'm sorry about that. We were hoping to see how wonderful Alastair's hair was in his catalogue pose, and I'm afraid it's not working out today. I don't have any hair, so we don't talk too much about that anyway. So a couple of other questions. I'm coming from Lazarus on free Pascal compiler, but used to program in Delphi in the ballroom days. Just bought Delphi Pro Sydney, blah, blah, blah. I want to install DCP crypt so I can use those controls. How do I do that? That's not really part of the what we're talking about today. Best idea is to ask on one of the forums, I think. There's plenty of them out there. Either the ones at the official Embarcadero ones, or just as well go to Delphi Praxis, which is a very big forum with lots of people there, and of course Slashdot and a few other places. Slashdot doesn't exist, yeah, a few other places as well. We're everywhere. Just go and ask at a forum, and someone asks that question. If you're really stuck, then email myself. My details are on there, and I will either answer the question myself or point them in the right direction.
And Stack Overflow, of course, is also always a good place to go.
Yes, I mean Stack Overflow. I don't know why I said Slashdot.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I missed that you said.
Yeah, and I've only drunk coffee today as well, which is I haven't got any excuses. I'm just crazy. Let's have a look. What are some of the other questions? We've answered most of them. Someone's talking about tuples. Yeah, no, we're not doing tuples. So everyone is saying, a couple of people saying, yeah, they use test-driven development and it's great. Most other people saying they don't use test-driven development. The test-driven development, they're talking about how it links with Agile. I should say that I am a fan of Agile, and I think we've got a different TCOF in code that we're going to talk about development methodologies coming up at some point in the future. But I have used Agile techniques, and I do still use them. I work on 2-week cadences for those that want to know what that is. And I use a Kanban board for my bugs and my issues and things like that. And I actually use a thing called the Pomodoro technique as well. So if you want to Google that, I find that helps me with focus. So test-driven development is part of Agile, and it is part of extreme programming, which I don't do. But Agile for things like you know, being more accurate in your predictions of when you're going to ship something, because you have a thing called a minimum viable product, is very useful when you're dealing with people who don't really have a clear idea of what it is that they want and keep changing it, moving goalposts. With Agile, you can defend yourself from those kind of people whose keep saying, I've paid you all this money and I want to have it looking like this instead. Well, you're going to need to pay some more then, because my time is money. You know. Barb Arnold says she's a QA person, and my favorite response back from a developer is, no one does that. Yeah, we all know that that QA people, they have a good way of coming up with tests. I know people that go into boxes that say things like last name or surname in England, and they type in 750 characters if they can get away with it, and go, why doesn't it accept 750 characters? Why does it only accept 300 characters for a last name? And the developer will always say, well, no one's going to have a last name that's got more than 300 characters. And they say, well, it might. That's nonsense. You know, tests have got to be realistic. You can't write a test for absolutely everything. You'll be there forever. You know, it's one of those things. Shall we talk about audits and metrics and toxicity metrics in particular? Who's got some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the good starting point for anyone is using the toxicity metrics, because they're so accessible in the Delphi IDE. I think they're introduced in XE8 or something, or Seattle.
It was XE8, I think. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so it was part of Dahlia that got integrated into Delphi, and basically it gives you a list of all the functions and procedures in your application, ranking them by the sort of their toxicity level, which is sort of some combination of cyclomatic complexity and lines of code. The cyclomatic complexity is the number of paths that a procedure can take. So if you've got an if statement, it'll have a complexity of 2, or two if statements. It goes up from there. So you have 4 paths at that point, and so it gives you a good indication as to where to target. If you're cleaning up code, things with high toxicity are a good point to look at. Sometimes functions and procedures just have to be long. If you're reading in data and you're just matching up fields or something like that, you might have hundreds of lines of code that are just matching things up. Although you should kind of shuffle that into something configurable rather than code. But yeah, and of course the audits and metrics are also integrated into Delphi, and well worth playing with. So the metrics give you a crazy amount of detail about your code in terms of, the cyclomatic complexity is probably a good starting point to look at, but there's also things like, fan in and fan out of your classes and things like that you can look at in ridiculous detail. There's probably only a few there that I'd actually find useful, but yeah.
I think the cyclometric complexity one is a good one, because cyclometric complexity is about, how complicated is this thing that you've just written in general terms, and should you break it down into smaller manageable chunks to be less complicated? And that is kind of a very bad summary of what it does. I do use this, by the way. I use the toxicity metrics, both on old code and new code. And I find I write better new code as a result of using the toxicity metric on the old code, and finding out all the things I did 10 years ago that were really appalling. Oh boy. And there are people out there that have this code. I don't know. But it's like having someone that nags you all the time when you run these tests. The metrics are, excuse me, the metrics are very, very useful, and I don't always agree with some of the metrics, because sometimes you have to use your judgment and say, this is nonsense. I know it's the right idea, but it's just not going to work for me.
Yeah, I think it's worth being aware of that. Typically, as your procedure gets larger, its complexity is not going up linearly. So something that's a procedure that's twice as long is not necessarily twice as complicated. It might be 4 times as complicated, or some exponential power.
Well, sometimes writing a procedure or something like that, you can write it a more long form way because it's more understandable, or even more efficient. Because generics, for example, are a very good example of something that is very useful and can make your code extremely powerful, but it can also make your code very slow. If you use them, unwisely, shall we say, then you can cause yourself problems. So sometimes you might do something a slightly longer way because even though there's a quicker and better way of doing it, and the toxicity metrics will like that, the actual reality is that you could end up with something a little bit more horrible. Have you ever used ProDelphi? Have you ever used that program at all?
No.
Okay. Well,
ProDelphi
is I think it's what it's called. I'll have to look it up. But ProDelphi is it's one of these programs that can it runs like very granular timers on your code for performance profiling, and the Pro stands for profiling, and it does some very interesting profiling.
I think as you mentioned, you shouldn't be afraid to write verbose code. You should always write code with readability in mind first. You're going to write that code once, but you're going to be maintaining it potentially forever. So it might take you 5 minutes to write, but if over the next decade you're looking at that 10 times, that might represent several hours of going through that code and having to re-understand it each time you look at it. So your
comments don't make sense either, because you knew exactly what you meant when you wrote that comment 12 years ago.
Yeah, and also if you're writing comments, that might be an indication that you need to use better variable names and introduce, maybe add some explaining variables or something like that to make your code read more cleanly.
Apart from all these tools, I often encounter a lot of legacy code, and it's surprising and terrifying how many hints and errors are still available if you simply compile the project. And I have a list of warnings that should even be turned into errors, and they will turn into errors in some projects, like the for loop, which is undefined after a loop. It surprises me, but sometimes I still find this as an error in a legacy project where people ask me to take a look at and help them because it crashes for some reason.
Yeah,
and that's just available in the IDE.
My personal rule is that I never ever check in code that has any hints, warnings, or errors ever. And even if it means that sometimes the compiler gets it wrong, and there are some hints that they're definitely they could be improved. The hint is making a hint about something, but actually it's not particularly correct. And that is probably one in 500,000 lines.
Yeah, I've worked on legacy projects that have had thousands of warnings and hints, and I mean, most of them are just like unused variables and things like that. So not a big deal. And I did. There's a couple of large projects I worked on, I just basically worked through all of them, and you do come across a few bugs when you go through and have a look at these hints and warnings. And that's just the Delphi idea. I mean, people should be able to spot these straight away, but I suppose when there are already hundreds of hints and warnings present, spotting one additional one is it can be quite complicated.
Yeah, but you can turn some warnings into errors, and that will help you.
Yeah, I totally get what you're saying there, Bob. You're basically saying the official, level of complaint by the compiler would be warning, but instead it's probably better to turn it into an error so that it actually won't compile.
There are several warnings that are plain errors.
Yeah, for sure. I absolutely agree. And this is what bugs me about it. To use the wrong term there, but it irritates me to work on someone's code where they will send it to me, and it's got a whole bunch of warnings. And I look at it and I think, how can you work like that? I'm sure if you're in progress writing something, I get it, but I will not, allow my program to go out the door or get checked in unless there are no hints, warnings, or errors, because it's just, I trust the compiler to be much smarter than I am. It isn't always, but it mostly is. And the linker, I know that a linker can remove all sorts of unused code that you might get hints and warnings about, but I don't want it to be the thing that catches the mistakes. I want me to be the thing that catches mistakes and go, why am I getting this warning? Why am I getting this hint? Why am I getting this error? Go back and fix the reason for it, because it's nearly always a bad thing that I've done. I've done something dumb and I go, oh, you know what? It's right. I did assign something there and it could overflow. And I never thought about that.
Unfortunately, a lot of code, legacy code, has hundreds or thousands of warnings inside.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's when I go, you know what? I really should have gone and become a professional fisherman. Yeah.
Yeah, I think hints and warnings are the place, a really good place to start when you're working with legacy code, before you start looking at some of these other tools that are listed here. And we could probably look at, and we've already mentioned metrics, but the audits are similar, but they're more about the things that you may have done wrong, and they range in things like from you've used inconsistent capitalization in your names of things to
yes.
actual you're not using a try finally, or you've forgotten to freeze something or something like that.
There was a guy I worked with. He was a contractor, okay, and I'm not going to say his name. He may even be on, because I know he does attend these webinars, so, just to see what I'm up to. And he had this weird thing, and I'm sure nobody will know who he is, so it's fine. But he always used to start his classes with a lowercase character. I don't understand why you would do that. Every single class I know begins with an uppercase, like T for T,
so,
date time or something like that.
Case. So starting with a lowercase and then having everything else, your
he
subsequent words.
Just for the classes. I said to him, why do you do this? I've always done it like that. And I'm like, you're crazy. Everybody you work with who's a Delphi programmer must hate you. He's like, no, it's fine. I'm like, no, really, this is a bad idea. And unfortunately, I didn't have the ability to say to him, stop doing that. And I have to say, he doesn't work with us anymore. And I've now gone through and actually corrected all his code and put all his classes to uppercase initial characters. Because I get camel case for people that are C# programmers, but this person was a Delphi programmer, not a C# programmer. C# people do camel casing and weird kind of capitalization. And I get that. It's everybody's different. But
the camel casing with the first character being capital, it's referred to as Pascal case. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's how ingrained into the language it is. And this guy, I tell you, drove me crazy. But anyway, I digress. The audits would have prevented that, but unfortunately,
not prevented it, but would have indicated it.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Same thing. He would have said, "This is a bad idea. Are you sure?"
Yeah. I think sticking to the standard formatting practices in Delphi. I know recently the white paper has been updated as to, I think Marco has. Updated.
Marco's done the style guide again.
Style guide, yes, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's the way
I've worked on projects that, like some really old project that was based around pointers to records rather than classes, because the pointers to records was much faster, and it was pre-Pascal. And the capitalization was really confusing in that, and I found that it made it harder for me to spot problems, because the layout wasn't what I was familiar with.
Right.
Things.
So I work with people who do things like they put their initial begin on the same line as then. And I actually, it's quite a common thing that people do that, where they've got a block of code with an if statement in, and they've got begin and end in that block, and they put the begin at the same level as the if then, which is actually quite a popular thing to do. But the style guide actually specifically says not to do that, and that's the way I do it. I write it with the begin underneath the if. And there's a few other examples of the style guide where it says things, and yet I know there are a lot of people out there that do it differently.
Yeah,
I think
if it's your own personal project and you're the only developer, then do whatever you want. But if you're working with a team,
say that as long as nobody's ever going to come back and maintain your code.
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. Because basically, if you bring on a new developer, they're just going to be confused for ages with your weird layout
and hate you. They're going to hate on you. They're going to hunt you down. They're going to smash your keyboard and say, "That's it. You're not allowed to program anymore." Yeah, I think certain things, certain audits, you should be able to turn them on and make them mandatory, so that people can't check code. I mean, GitHub has got some actions and things like check these.
Yeah, I've never done it, but I think the audits and metrics you can run from the command line,
right,
and output as an XML file, and then you can use that. You could use that to prevently to make a chicken fail.
Yeah,
you can certainly do that with Pascal Analyzer as well.
Well, whilst we're talking about tests, Kirk says about the fact that we don't have video today because of GoToWebinar having broken video streaming, and that's why our webcams aren't working. He says, "I love it. A bug in GoToMeeting as we're discussing tests." Exactly true. Yeah, if it can go wrong, it will go.
On the subject of style guide, also use the automatic formatter in Delphi, the Control D.
Oh yes.
Or I think it's meant to be from the project menu or something. There's a but yeah, Control D can be your friend to quickly format, and that's also highly customizable. I basically, the only things I change in that is my user statements. I like each file on its own line, which is easy enough to configure, and I push out the right margin to 120 rather than 80 characters because
yeah, me too.
Screens are much wider these days. 80 characters.
When you work on teams of developers, one of the things that's useful is to have an agreed Delphi formatter set of settings. Because there was one guy I worked with, must be nearly 15 years ago, and he had different set of settings to everybody else. I don't know why he just did. Very good programmer, but the first thing he would do when he checked out a unit out of source code control would be to format the unit. It doesn't matter whether it was his unit, he was going to go and change something in there or fix a bug or add a very small feature or something like that. He would format the unit, and that would move everything around and change everything. Then he'd check that code back in once he'd worked on it, and it would look like he'd made 600 lines of changes. Because some of the comparisons, like beyond compare works pretty well, but not all of them. The comparison can't tell that all you've done is reformat the code rather than change the code. So it does it on a line by line basis and go, hey, this line's different. And so
that makes it really hard. Go back using blame or something like that. You want to know why does this line of code do what it does?
Who changed
it? Go back
and
who changed it last? You can look at blame and.
If you need to format something and change without changing code, then that should be separate commit. So you can see.
That's a brilliant point.
Changes.
Yeah, I fully agree with that.
Yeah, that's an absolutely brilliant point. I mean, luckily, a lot of the time I am working on my own, but I do, collaborate on a lot of projects. But they tend to be that we're working on different sections, so it's not quite as bad. And there's one guy I'm working with in Tunisia at the moment who the first thing he said was, let's agree a set of standards on how we format the program. And that's why I liked him straight away. I'm like, yes, see, you get it. You totally get it. And that is the key thing, I think, because as you said, Alastair, if you format things differently, it makes it quite difficult to understand the code because you're having to translate. It's like someone speaking French to you. No disrespect, Patrick, who is in the background there. I'm saying this is his weekly French lesson, but English lesson. But it's like speaking a different language and having to translate that language into another language that is also one that you don't necessarily speak, because you're trying to understand their formatting and say, oh, well, hang on, this structure that they've set up here is the same as the way I do it. It's just formatted differently. So it adds a level of complexity to an already complex task that you just don't need. If you both do, all of the people that work on it agree on the formatting and a set of standards, then it actually removes that one particular barrier to making the job harder than it needs to be, which is really what we're all about here with tests and stuff like that. Is trying to make your life as easy as possible and as stress-free as possible by preventing problems before they get to production, which is really what it's all about. So you've got, Alastair, it's a short slide here. You've got some other points.
It is, yeah. Yeah,
Source monitor and Pascal analyzer. Do you want to talk about those?
So, yeah, absolutely. I think so. Definitely, the audits and metrics and toxicity metrics, you should just be playing around with them because they're free. They're built into Delphi. So give them a go. They might tell you something useful about your code. They might not. Pascal analyzer, the light version is free, and that has lots of reports that are quite useful. The full version, it's not particularly expensive, and the full version will give you a huge amount of detail. And things just ranging from unused code to missing const as a parameter on a parameter and things like that are just quite helpful. So I definitely recommend, if nothing else, just download the free version of Pascal, the free version, the light version, and run that on your application and see what it tells you. The source monitor it supports a whole bunch of languages. It's free, and basically it stores a database of how your code is evolving over time. So you run it on your application, and at a given point, and it'll store all the sort of psychometric complexity about various units and functions and things like that into a database. And then at a later date, you can run it again and then compare. Is your application getting more complicated or worse? If the overall psychometric complexity is going up on your application, you might need to look at tidying the code up a bit. Otherwise, things might get out of hand very quickly, and you might be going from adding lots of features quickly to just going around in circles fixing bugs. So it's an interesting from that point of view. But the other thing you can do with it is if you're running version control, you can just check out you can check out your first version and run it on that, and then check out a later version and run it again, and so you can do it historically as well. So I'd recommend that. It's free. It's worth having a play with. Version control analysis, I don't have any specific tools here. I did write some of my own at some point for a project. And basically you look at things like what files change most frequently. So if you've got certain files that are changing way more frequently than anything else, it might be that those either they're just really important files or that they've got too much responsibility and you need to split them up into smaller a bunch of smaller files. So there's all sorts of things you can look at there, and if you're recording bugs and things like that in a consistent way, you can look at which units are the most bugs occurring in, which units are you adding the most features to, and that kind of thing. And these last two tools listed here are IDE plugins, and they will look at common patterns or anti-patterns, I suppose, in your code for potential bugs that might be the case. So it might be just things such as you're creating a class but not surrounding it with a try-finally, or you're doing something weird in that respect, or there's a a method on a class that's never called from within your application, you might potentially be able to just delete it, and various things like that. And so both Fix Insight Pro and Pascal Expert, IDE plugins, they're kind of you can basically run them highly frequently and keep an eye on your code, and they'll hopefully spot bugs, and they're both inexpensive. So I'd also highly recommend at least trying the trial versions out of those.
Yeah, I
Does
mean,
anyone else has?
I think that the thing we have here is that actually you're highlighting the fact there's no real excuse.
Yeah.
There's something for everyone, and for every budget and pocket. And I mean, I don't want to pretend that we do all the things right. Nobody does. Nobody is that kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Ideal example developer who does all the right things in all the right ways. I'm sure Bob is, because Bob is great.
No,
and Dahlia, I absolutely know. Dahlia, I'm sure you do too. And of course, Alastair does, and I do too. But apart from that, nobody ever does all the right things. But the point is, it's about a goal. It's about an aim. It's about an intention to try and do things to help yourself and to try and embrace the best practices, because the best practices are not just fads. They're not just fashions. They actually have an outcome that's beneficial to people. And if you've never written a unit test before, then I definitely recommend looking at the DUnit sites and a few other things as well and trying it out. Because
I put a couple of videos in the chat on, one is a TDD example. It's the 10-pin bowling kata, where you just write the algorithm for 10-pin bowling using test-driven development. And the other is a bug I found in system.zip in Delphi, and how just writing a unit test for that to confirm that confirm the bug is present, and then working out a way of fixing that bug, and getting the test to pass.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, really, isn't it? That when I get people say, "Oh, there's a bug in the program," the first thing I say is, "Show me how to make it go wrong," because I always know when I'm dealing with a QA person or a customer or somebody like that who's not really empathetic, shall we say, or empathic. What's the word I'm looking for? Doesn't get my point of view, because what they'll say is, I got this error message, and you're like, what is it? And he says, oh, it said something about it couldn't save the data. And I'll say to them, and it will annoy them, what exactly did the error message say? Because not saving the data could be a lot of different reasons. For example, it could be that your server's dead. It could be that you've done it wrong, and it's actually not an error message, but a warning saying, I'm unable to save the data until you correct the following errors.
Yes, or it could be that you put an apostrophe in the surname, and your code has crashed because you're not escaping your SQL or something like that. Yeah, so it could be a genuine bug, or it could be just...
They deliberately tried to break it, which is another thing. You get people that just exist to make my life a misery. That's how I see them. I'm sure they
reproducing bugs can be horribly complicated. If you're working with an application that has a large amount of configuration involved in it, getting it into the same state might be extremely difficult. So as much, if you are reporting bugs, then as much information as possible can be helpful.
There's a certain class of person that's very good at reporting bugs, and if anything, gives you too much information. But you know what? I want too much information, because there's a very good book by, I forget his name now. In fact, I should Google it, because it's such a good book. Let me think. I'm going to kick myself. I can't remember this. Steve Krug, and his book called "Don't Make Me Think."
Yes.
And if I'm just going to try and find a link to it that isn't like a Here we go. I'm going to put it in the chat window. Steve Krug, Don't Make Me Think. Okay. What Steve Krug talks about there is human-computer interaction, which is kind of one of the things that I specialize in, is user interface design and usability interaction and stuff like that. But he also talks about web usability, and he is kind of bringing up the points that I bring up, which is, if you tell me there's a problem in the program, tell me how to make it go wrong in a way where I don't have to think about reproducing it. Because if someone sends me someone's payroll, their time card or something like that, they'll say the figures aren't right, the totals aren't right. And I'll say, which totals? The weekly, the period totals, the monthly totals, which totals aren't right? So they get all annoyed because then they have to give me some more information. And I say to them, get a screenshot of the report, circle the number that is wrong, tell me why you think it's wrong and what you thought it should be, and also show me what parameters you put into the report to make that report appear, and give me a backup of your data. Well, why have I got to do that? Because then I can definitely reproduce your problem rather than reproduce what I think is your problem and fix what I think is your problem and give you back a program that doesn't fix your problem. And Steve Krug makes some very good points in his book about that, which is, the more you make me think, the more the chances are that I'll think about the wrong thing and get it wrong for you. If you make it easy, so I don't have to think, it's a no-brainer, literally no-brainer into fix a particular problem or redesign a screen so that it works correctly. And it's just one of those things that, if you're a professional developer, it's one of those books you should be reading if you haven't already. Okay, Pete Edwards says, Peter, I know, I've worked for Peter in the past. Let's agree that test-driven development has its place. It's not for every developer, but it's probably essential for teams. I don't know. I think for individuals.
About that, testing is for everyone. Even especially if you're a single developer, then you should do your testing because you don't have time to test all your code manually every time you change something. So it is really important that you write tests. Maybe you will not have everything tested, but some parts, really crucial parts of the code, they should be tested.
Yeah, I mean, the ideal, as I said before, is what our intention should be. The reality might not be that you have a test for every single thing that you do, but some things, if they're critical enough, you've really got to have a test for it.
Yes, you want to know that your data is correct. You want to know that your serialization works right. There's plenty of things you can test rather easily, and those things absolutely should be tested. And there was a question, how do you start testing existing applications when you have all the code written? Well, this is also the way you should start testing. So start with most critical things and the things you have isolated. So you can test the integrity of your data, you can test your serialization code, anything that you can, you have well-defined inputs and outputs, everything that is separated enough so you can start writing some tests around it. And if you don't, if you have everything written in event handlers on the form, then of course you will not be able to test that. But even if you have application like that, you can start by moving code from event handlers to separate units, separate classes, and then start testing those. So it is a process, but it can be done.
Yeah, I'm going to recommend a book here as well, and that's Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers, which I've read a couple of times, and that's got a lot of useful information about how to refactor your code so that it's testable.
And that's definitely the de facto standard, of course, is code complete, which a lot of people haven't read and probably should, even if they disagree with some of the points that are brought up in there. But Code Complete is a book that really kind of talks about, you know, doing everything to the maximum level of what you should be doing. I think that the reality is a lot of us don't do everything that's in that book, but at least embracing some of the ideas in there, and embracing some of the ideas, and you know, Don't Make Me Think, and the book you just mentioned, Alastair, I think it's you know, it's going to help you, you know, to you know, write code that is more stable, more reliable, and you can have some faith in that when you ship it, it's not going to fall to pieces. Bruce McGee says, using test-driven development changes how you write your code. The tests themselves are almost secondary. And I know that Bruce he's an MVP, I think. Bruce, yes. I know that Bruce is an exponent of test-driven development. I should have remembered him. He definitely believes in it. He's not the only one. There's a few other MVPs out there who really probably should be sitting here instead of me and talking about test-driven development. But we're not saying that that's the way to go for everybody. But what we are saying is that some of these things like the audits and metrics and toxicity and static code analysis and fixing site, which is from TMS, and a few of these others, you know, they're things that you can look at. And Bruce McGee says, test-driven development for the win. Yeah, so he's listening, isn't he? Yeah, it's good. Where are we at? Let's see. We've still got a few more minutes to go. I think we've kind of talked about test-driven development. Wagner Landgraf was going to be on today, and he's not. He's doing something else. I'm not quite sure. Could possibly be more important than Go, but there you go. But he had this slide. I think it's his slide. Nobody else is it? Anybody else been playing this slide?
Correct. I think it's his.
That is his, yeah. Okay, I think he put this slide in. Behind the scenes, we all kind of gathered together and put some little slides in, which is why I'm a little bit murky on who wrote these slides, everyone. But Wagner, guy I got a lot of respect for, great guy. You'll see on the blogs.embarcadero.com, we've started doing a new series of what's it like to be a developer, and then the name of the developer. Wagner is one of those people that is coming up shortly. I must badger Alastair, Bob Schwartz, who's still on the line, and Dahlia. You should all fill out my questions as well. I have to email them to you, but it's basically an interview asking what it's like to be a developer from a developer's point of view. And people seem to like that idea of some questions, you know, stupid ones as well, like, you know, what's the worst day you ever had as a developer and stuff like that. I want to try and pull back the curtains on what it is actually like to be a developer for those people that are either just starting out in development or aren't developers, but considering what it might be like as a job, and what's a typical day as a developer, for example, because I think some people who are not in that industry don't know what it means to be a developer. But Wagner's one of those people that's already responded. 1 D unit to rule them all, he says. I don't quite know what he meant by that, but I think he means that D unit is the de facto test unit, and I think that's probably true. His is an up-to-date repository. I think the other D unit is slightly out of date. And he says it unifies all the different D unit versions around the latest D unit changes. D unit itself is based on a previous framework as well, which was for Java, I think, and there's even an X unit, I think, as well, and a few others. This one for Wagner stuff includes the Delphi leak check repository, and he thinks there's some other bits and bobs as well. It's also compatible with Free Pascal, which is a good thing. Free Pascal is a perfectly adequate language. I think Rad Studio's IDE is better than Lazarus, but there you go, that's my personal opinion. And he also says it's compatible with TMS Web Core. To point out that Wagner does actually work for TMS, so he's got a slight bias towards TMS, but the Web Core, it's ironic that he's misspelt the product name because it's supposed to be capital WEB, as TMS have reminded me several times whenever I said the name, but it's compatible with that. So you can do unit tests for all of those things. Someone else is now posting comments about 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to bind them, Lord of the Rings. Yes, okay. we now give you your super nerd badge, Mr. Questioner. Right, let's see what else. Grab a beverage and relax. I think we're kind of exhausted our questions. Is that right, or am I misunderstanding? Let's have a look. Yeah, okay. We talked at the start about the Desktop First User Experience Summit. I'll just remind you again, because if you weren't here at the start, which you may not have been, there's a few more people now than when we first kicked off. The Desktop First User Experience Summit is happening on August the 30th till September the 3rd. It's online and it's completely free. I'll be one of the speakers on there. I'll be talking about some things to do with design, probably a bit about Fluent UI, Windows UI 3, and also Windows 11, the new changes that are happening on that, and also discussing the ideas of why designing an app for mobile first and then trying to grade it upwards to desktop is a very, very bad idea. You know, there's got lots of reasons why desktop design and mobile design shouldn't be the same thing. You shouldn't try and get one project to do both. Even if you are using FireMonkey, it's a bad idea. And actually trying to shoehorn the user interface in to fit everything, I think, my opinion is it's not a good idea. But that's what this summit's all about. So summit.desktopfirst.com. Go over there, click on book now, and you know, there's lots of talks and presentations, and I think there's a few handouts and lots of hands-on code sessions as well, by the way. We talked about the upcoming Tea, Coffee and So code sessions, but I think I'll just leave that there for now. I think we've answered all the questions. They're mostly all talking about why it's a good idea to do unit testing, and then a few people saying don't understand test-driven development, and lots of other people saying test-driven development is very cool, etc., etc. SonarQube has a plugin now, which maintained that it just updated this week. That's interesting. Is one of the questions. That's from Martin Sedgwick. SonarQube, if you're not sure what it is, it's a test framework, I believe. Just seeing if we've got any other questions that we haven't answered. Do you have an example of warnings? This is probably one for Bob, actually. Bob, Chris Peters asked, do you have an example of warnings that should be errors?
Oh, yes. One of them is for loop variable could be undefined after the loop. Function result may be undefined. And something like a variable which may have not been initialized. That may not always be a real warning, but at least these three are important ones to look out for.
Yeah, a good point. And the for loop variable is a very interesting one as well, because am I right in saying that I think Delphi 10.41, I think, it actually is an error now. I could be wrong, but I thought that now if you try and use that, oh, it's still a warning.
10.4 today.
Oh, okay, then maybe I'm misremembering it. I mean, the short answer is that I remember in early versions of the compiler, if you try to use a variable that had been used in a for loop, all sorts of weird things would happen. And I don't understand the implementation behind the scenes, but it's just one of those things you shouldn't do. And I've actually seen someone who used code where they used a for loop to initialize a variable, which they then later used in some code. And I just don't understand the thinking behind that. But
I think these days with 10.4, you should use inline variables with your for loops. So you say, you know,
yes,
for var I is assigned whatever, and so that your loop iteration variable is only defined within the for loop.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I have to say I don't like inline variables. I'm one of those weird people who go, you know, it's not. It's a deviation.
I've just started using them, and there's been instances where it's just made the code so much more easier to manipulate.
I totally get it, and I have used them on the odd occasion, but it still makes me shudder a little bit. I've been writing.
Yeah, I'm still uncertain about them because I feel there's probably some obscure bugs that might occur because of them. But yeah, I think it does make for a lot more elegant code.
Yeah, and it can compartmentalize the code a little bit as well, and the scope of the variables is a little bit more obvious sometimes as well, which is a good thing.
And
anything
it does make refactoring easier too. If the variable is defined close to where it's being used, you can just pull out that chunk of code. And I've also found that the refactoring extract method and what have you doesn't seem to be working very well in 10.4. So I'm not quite sure what's happened there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few little issues like that. I think that are being addressed. Okay, don't get the hump with camel case. Oh, very good. Yes, I will ignore that question. And a couple of people saying they use code formatting all the time. Let Delphi format the code. So to write the code, and then they use the Control-D before they check things in, which I think is probably not a bad idea.
Yeah, I think the code format also has a command line option to it as well, so you can before the code gets checked in, you can automatically format it so that all code that's checked in is conforms to.
You're such a mine of this information. It's quite incredible. I don't know how you remember all of this, because I barely remember what day it is, let alone all the little.
Yeah, I've never used it, but I've kept thinking that's probably something I should investigate and try and get going.
You remember it's there though. You see, that's the thing.
Yeah.
You remember. Yeah, I mean, I'm a big fan of your videos. I have to say to the people out there listening, I may be an MVP, but I still learn stuff from Alastair and Bob.
I learn stuff from my own videos. I Google something, how to do something, and it comes back with one of my videos, and it's like, okay, there was a time in the past I knew how to do it, but.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dahlia's books are also one of those things where you read through it and you go, I know that bit, but wow, I didn't know that. And that's the thing. It's the second person, and we're all MVPs. We write code, Delphi code, all the time, and we're supposed to know, a good chunk of stuff, which I think we do. But that doesn't mean to say you can't learn more. I've been a developer for 38 years, and I still learn something every single day. It's still a job where I get up and I really love doing what I'm doing and writing about it and presenting about it. Someone's asking about.
Nobody knows everything. You always have something for learn.
No, absolutely, and I think that's one of the strengths of working on a team. Sometimes is that one person like yourself might be good on threads and memory management and stuff. Another person might be really good at the user interface kind of side of things and dealing with that. Another person might be an absolute whiz at doing anything to do with data structures and algorithms. And I think this is the thing, that sometimes diversity in a team, where you all acknowledge and have a safe place to be wrong, but have someone else who can come and say, actually, this is how to do it without being judgmental about it, is probably one of the biggest benefits you can have in a team, is that you all recognize that no one person can be the answer to everything.
Yeah, I think Delphi maybe 5, 6, or 7 was probably like the last one of those would be the last version where someone could potentially know more or less everything about the the IDE and the language and the runtime library. But now it's just the runtime library is so huge, and the IDE has so many features and interfaces with so many different platforms and what have you. It's just basically impossible for an individual to know.
Yeah, I think you're right. Delphi 7 was kind of the pinnacle of, where I kind of knew absolutely everything about it, and I knew all the little tweaks and twerks and bizarre things that went on, and then it just went away. Yeah, I turned to one side, didn't pay attention, and the whole world changed around me. I think with the Rad Studio moving towards XE was when things really started to get crazy, especially FireMonkey. That was a whole big framework that got introduced that did things very, very differently. And,
I feel like I'm only just starting to get into using FireMonkey now. So I've been writing a Minesweeper clone.
It's got some very good features, but it's also got some things where I think I must go and complain to someone about that. I must go and tell them what I think about it. it's one of those things, and I'm sure that people will say the same thing about VCL. So, okay, all right. Well, we're nearly at the top of the hour. In fact, we're actually 4 minutes over. Is there anything you want to say before we go, Alastair? I'll give you the chance.
Just thank everyone for attending. I think, you know, so many developers just do the 9 to 5, you know, turn up for work, do the work, go home, and then completely forget about programming. I think, yeah, just, you know, like to say my appreciation for everyone who's you know, taking some extra time to improve their craft and what have you. So yeah, thank you.
Sure. And Bob, any final words from you?
No, just thanks everyone for attending, and I hope to be here again next week.
Excellent. You're here next week as well. Yeah, that's brilliant. Or you're doing the code profiling, is it? Optimization and performance?
Yes.
Ah, cool. Okay. Dahlia, anything?
Well, thank you everyone for listening. And one thing to keep in mind, and that is that testing saves time. It doesn't spend time, it saves time. So it is good to test your code.
Absolutely. And that would probably be my final words as well, which is everybody does everything perfectly, because it really isn't true. And don't beat yourself up if you don't do all the things that you see in webinars and things like that. A lot of the webinars, particularly things like Microsoft webinars, they rehearse many times over before they present their code, and they polish it, and there are people to make them look good and all the rest of it. Don't fall for it. Imposter syndrome is a very big problem in the industry. Even MVPs.
Yeah, I feel like I'm a good programmer, but I look at some people on like, you know, Slashdot, and I know it's not Slashdot, they're making your mistake now, Stack Overflow, and just the, you know, the quality of their answers and things like that make me feel a bit inadequate at times. So
yeah,
I think,
luckily I'm so arrogant that I don't ever feel like that. No, I'm joking. But it's true. You know, anybody out there listening, we're all just developers, all of us that are on here today, and you know, been around for a long time, some of us, and got quite a lot of broad experience. But every single one of you is you know, don't worry about, you know, oh, I don't do test-driven development, I don't do this and don't do that. Look into it, decide if it's for you, look at the benefits, and then make a decision, I think would be my advice. Anyway, well, thanks very much, everybody. I know the slides are broken, and we are going to make sure that the slides do get issued out. Salut, Patrick. I said I would speak some French for him. He's listening in intently. As his English lesson, he calls these T-Coffee and Code. And we will also make sure that the video replays get publicized quite nicely. It will be on the Embarcadero official YouTube channel, and there's a playlist for all of the T-Coffee and Code sessions. We'll also publish it on blogs.embarcadero.com, where you should go, because there are lots of articles from lots of different people about lots of different subjects. And follow us all on Twitter and Embarcadero as well. Embarcadero Tech at Twitter is the address. Thanks very much. We'll speak to you all again very soon next week. Bye, everyone.
Hello.